Hey, we're going to be in a new series titled Presence People. And if I can think of the top core value of Jesus Center, it would be the presence of God. And if you're looking for a specific title for today's message, we're going to call this one The Profile of Presence People. And we're going to be in Exodus chapter 33, and we're just going to go verse by verse here. But growing up, I had a very unintelligent dog that was our pet named Lily. She was a Labrador mix, and I would try to walk her and take her to the park, and yet she would be drawn to the smelly creations of the other animals in our neighborhood, and she would get locked in or fixated on those things. So I would pull her leash and say, "Lily, I am trying to take you to the park. Let's go." I said, "Let's go." And the harder I would pull, the harder she would pull back. And I felt like it was a tug of war. And that is what the Bible calls being stiff-necked. And as long as we were locked in that power struggle, we weren't going anywhere. And I remember thinking she could injure herself if she keeps fighting me. And that's precisely how God felt about the Israelites. Look with me, Exodus chapter 33, verse 1. Some of you will need to flip with me on your phones here. "And then the Lord said to Moses, 'Leave this place, you and the people you brought up from out of Egypt, and go to the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey. But I will not go with you, because you are a stiff-necked people, and I might destroy you on the way.'" The Israelites were like a cart that was trying to stay in front of a horse. And here God is saying, it's not going to be pretty if we continue on like this. So let's go ahead and go our separate ways. Now, we're talking about the profile of presence people. Number one, for my note takers, presence people have a desire to be directed by God. Presence people aren't saying, "God, follow me." Presence people are saying, "God, lead me." But you know what I found? I found that when you say, "God, lead me," God will lead you and He'll follow you. He'll go along with you. So to be presence people, it requires humility, a sensitivity to God, flexibility. And there are personalities that just don't want to be led by anybody. But if we want to be presence people, when God says, "Let's go," we can't dig in our heels. If we want to be presence people, when God says, "Stay put," let's stay back, pause, we can't be racing off. Presence people have to have a desire to be directed by God and a willingness to be led by God. We can't be stiff-necked if we're going to be presence people. And we have to be people who want to be led by God rather than circumstances. Sometimes God will tell us, "Trust me," over the circumstances. Sometimes God will say, "Trust me," even though it doesn't make sense. And looking back at my life, the times I really sensed God's presence in the most amazing ways was when God was directing me into something, and God was leading me into something, and I was stepping out in faith. I remember when I felt called by God to come to the South Bay and pioneer a church. And yet I had a lot of scary thoughts between my ears. What if this fails? I heard people tell me, "You can't build a church in the South Bay. It's a graveyard for churches." However, I sensed, as I was stepping out and following God, I sensed God's presence. I sensed God's pleasure. And I sensed God's peace. So following God may mean that you may have unsettled thoughts up here, but you can have confidence in here. Because in your heart, you sense God's presence, you sense God's pleasure, and you sense God's peace. But did you catch what God was offering the Israelites? He was saying, "I will commission an angel, and you're going to get angelic assistance to ensure that you can get into the promised land." God was making them a deal, and most people would think that this was a great deal. He was saying, I'm going to make sure that you get into the promised land, but I will not go with you. And how many of you would say that's a good deal? How many of you would say that's a bad deal? Presence people say that is a terrible deal. But did you know if you don't want to be led by God, and there are many people who don't care for being led by God, they may still get some of the promises of God, but they will go without the presence of God. If you don't want to be led by God, you may still get some of the promises of God, but you're going to get them without the sense of the presence of God. So what if God was offering you a deal this morning, saying, I will give you whatever you want, yet I won't be with you and you won't be with me? Will you say deal or no deal? This is what God was pitching to them. You could do things your way. Go ahead and be a free agent, and I will still be good enough to make your dreams come true. And yet, I won't be hanging out with you anymore. Deal or no deal? That's when presence people say no deal. Because presence people don't want the promises without the presence. And I know many people would have said, God, that's a great deal. Some people would even say, God, that is a steal. I get to do whatever I want and stay in my rebellious ways and maintain my rebellious spirit and still see all my dreams come true. But you're going to actually see in a few moments why it's a horrible deal. Even though it seems like a good deal, it's a terrible deal. And to the credit of the Israelites, they said, no deal. The thought of God's promises without God's presence actually terrified them. Look with me in verse 4 of Exodus 33. When the people heard these distressing words, they began to mourn, and no one put on any ornaments. This broke their heart, the idea that they can get into the land, but God is not going to be hanging with them. Now let's drop to verse 12, because Moses is now having a follow-up meeting with God about the future of the Israelites and whether they're going to have the presence of God with them. In verse 12, Moses said to the Lord, you've been telling me, lead these people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Here, Moses is basically saying, Lord, I didn't get your RSVP yet. He's saying, Lord, you did not confirm that you were coming. And knowing Moses, his position was clear. God, if you're going to just send an angel, I don't care if it's Gabriel or if it's Michael. I don't want to do this. No deal. I don't care how successful we can become. I don't care how good the land is. Without the sense of your presence, no deal. Can somebody say no deal? No deal. And I believe, though, a lot of people would just settle for an angel. An angel can represent something that is from God. Your friends are angels. This church may be an angel. Somebody was praying at the Saturate prayer, this church saved my life. This church changed my life. This church can be like an angel. Or how about spiritual gifts? They can be like an angel. Angels can bring breakthroughs and can open doors to blessings. And yet, let me ask you today, let's just say God is saying you can have a life that has the greatest friends. You can have a life where you're part of the best church. You can even have an impressive position in that amazing church. And you can have the most phenomenal spiritual gifts. You can heal, you can prophesy, and you can have all kinds of knowledge and wisdom. And you can receive tons of breakthroughs and blessings, even financial blessings in your life. Would you want that? Would you want that? And I'm sure a lot of people would say, that sounds really good to me. But Moses was different. Moses was saying, forget it. No deal. No presence, no deal. Because presence people want more than an angel. Presence people want more than friends from God. Presence people want more than a church of God. Presence people want more than prophetic or healing gifts from God. Presence people want more than breakthroughs and blessings from God. Presence people want God. And can I get an amen from any presence people out there? Amen. Presence people want God. So let's keep reading here. Moses is now going to repeat to God what God had told him. He says, "You have said, I know you by name, and you have found favor with me." You know what I love about this piece of the conversation? Moses spent 40 years in the hall of shame. If you know Exodus, that he killed an Egyptian and had to flee Egypt because of what he had done. And then his name became a curse word in Egypt. He was disgraced. His name was disparaged in Egypt, and even among his own people, who started to think he was nuts. But you know what's funny? Even though they bashed him for his nuttiness, they all benefited from it. Anyway, moving on. Presence people aren't perfect people, yet they know God's grace. Some of us think, well, I do not qualify to be a person of the presence because of my past. And yet, presence people may have a sketchy past. Presence people may have done shady things. And yet, presence people also know the grace of God. Amen? They know that they're known by God and that they are loved by God. Here God is telling Moses, I know you by name and I favor you. Let me bring this into modern language. Hey, Moses, I know there's many people out there who have spoken negatively about you, and your reputation has been tarnished. And your name is a four-letter word in some parts of the world. And yet, Moses, I really, really know you. People know a few things about what you did in the past, but Moses, I really know you. And Moses, I really like you. And I hope you can hear the heart of God speaking to you today, saying, I really know you. And I really like you. And I love this because I used to pursue God's presence as if I was a worthless beggar. I used to strive. I used to scream. I used to feel like I had to manipulate and twist God's arm into giving him maybe some drops of his presence. In 1 Kings 18, we see the priests of Baal, and they're trying to get the attention of Baal or Baal. And so what did they do? They started cutting themselves up in hopes that their God would release some rain. And yet we don't have to do that. Because here God is telling Moses, I know you, I love you, and I believe it's from that foundation of the grace of God that we pursue God's presence. We pursue God's presence not as beggars and not as orphans, but as beloved sons and daughters. And we pursue God's presence knowing that he wants to give us his presence even more than we want it. Here in Exodus chapter 33, verse 13, here is Moses praying. If you're pleased with me, teach me your ways so that I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Here we see Moses pursuing the heart of God. Presence people are after the heart of God. If you're somebody who's after God's heart, you will always carry God's presence. If you're chasing God's heart, by default, you will carry God's presence. David was a man who pursued God's heart. He was known as the man after God's heart. So he always carried the presence. The main difference between David and his predecessor Saul was that David was a man after the heart of God, when Saul was after the approval and the affections of people. But as long as you pursue God's heart, you will carry God's presence. And I wonder if we're people who are after God's heart. Now, I don't think we're going to get it perfect every time. I don't think we're going to bat 1,000 when it comes to all the decisions we have to make. But in your heart of hearts, are you pursuing God's heart? In your heart of hearts, do you want to be led? Do we want to be directed by God? Now, how do I know that Moses found God's heart? Because I believe not only did he chase God's heart, but he caught God's heart. And the proof of it is that he had a sacrificial, selfless love for God's people. Here in Exodus chapter 33, verse 13, the second half of that verse, he's praying, remember that this nation is your people. I mean, you ever read Exodus and you conclude that I think Moses was more compassionate than God? I think Moses loved the Israelites more than God did. But don't forget 1 John chapter 4, verse 7. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. Compassion is from God. And everyone who loves is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth not, knoweth not God, for God is love. Beloved, let us love one another. Do you know why Moses had such a big heart for Israel? Because he was a man who chased God's heart and caught God's heart. He was after God's heart, and he pursued God's heart, and now he personified God's heart. I found that some people do ministry and take on positions of leadership out of selfish motivations. They act like it's for people, but it's really all about them. And what they do is they use people and they use the ministry to feed their own egos. And somehow meet them in their own insecurities. But there is another type of minister. There is another type of leader. One who has sought and found the heart of God. And those people, those individuals, they begin to embody God's heart. And they start doing ministry and leading out of a sacrificial, selfless love. They don't use people. They love people. They aren't trying to take anything from the people. They're trying to get people and lead people into God's best for their lives. Here, Moses has such a heart for the Israelites because God did. And Moses and God's heart were entwined. I mean, don't you want that? Where our hearts and God's hearts can be knit together, fused together. Look with me, verse 14. And then the Lord replied, my presence will go with you. I'm giving you my RSVP. And I will give you rest. Do you know why it's a bad deal to get your dreams without the presence? Because the presence of God is the source of our peace. It's where we find true rest for our souls. The things in the world can bring us pleasure and even happiness, but it's only in the presence of God do we find true joy and peace. This is why it's a bad deal. It's a bad deal. Why would you want all of your dreams to come true when you're miserable in it? When anxiety and depression always have the best of us. It's the presence of God that we need, because presence people, they live from rest. The presence of God is synonymous with peace. And you know, I found with the presence of God, there are times where the presence of God is intense, but it's always peaceful, ironically. Some of you know what I'm talking about. There are times where you have an experience with the presence of God, an encounter, a collision with the presence of God. You experience the manifestation of God, and it's intense, and yet there still is a peace, a profound peace that's there. Look with me, verse 15, the next verse. And then Moses said to him, if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. For how will anyone know that you're pleased with me and your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish? Can somebody say distinguish? Distinguish. What else will distinguish me from all the other peoples on the face of the earth? What is going to distinguish us from them? Because presence people know that it's the presence that distinguishes us. Moses knew that the presence of God was their X factor. It's what gave them the it factor. It was their secret weapon. It was their special sauce. It was what made them shine. It was what would make them stand out. It was what makes them irrefutable. It's what makes them unforgettable. You know, God chose to work through the Israelites not only because He loved them, but He wanted to love the world through them. It was never His intent that they would just exclusively be God's people, but rather that they would be a light to the nations. And I believe that what enables us to be a light to the nations, where the nations begin to covet our relationship with God, it's not going to be our theology or our morality alone. It's not going to be our theology or our morality in itself. I don't know if you have caught on to this, but people aren't actually lining up to learn our theology. People aren't begging to adopt our morality. Even today, yet I do believe that every human heart is starving for the presence of God, is longing for the presence of God. As St. Augustine said, it's the God-shaped hole that's in every single person made in the image of God. And I do believe that when somebody is carrying the presence of God in a real and tangible way, the world will want to know more about our relationship with the Lord. You know, I grew up in church, yet I hated church. And my parents were very devoted, and so they would drag me and my sister to church, yet I never wanted to go. I still remember there were times I fought them tooth and nail, and I just stayed in the car and cried the whole time because I didn't want to go in. There were some bullies in the church, for one. And, I just never got much out of it. And I remember we went to some big churches where they had many members, they had expensive facilities, where they had a great band, an amazing sound system, or great programs, and they were the talk of the town. We went to some good churches, and yet I hated church. And it wasn't until my sister introduced me to a man who was pursuing the presence of God that I got turned on to God. I am the product. This church is the product of a presence person. He was a 22-year-old youth pastor. He was a student at Biola. And the church that he decided that he was going to serve was a small church, maybe about 40 people in the church, and maybe 6, 7, 8 youth. And because we didn't have our own facilities, we met in the storage unit. And yet here he would be with the guitar. I'm used to full bands. In fact, one of the churches I went to, they produced their own music, and they published it. I don't know what I'm not a music guy, so I don't know what the word is, but their music was popular. Other people around the nation were listening to it because their musicians were good. They're professionals. And here's this man who would just be in the storage room of a rundown church with 7 youth, and he would just begin to pursue the presence of God on his guitar. And he would just love on the Lord and worship. And the presence of God was so tangible in that storage room, where I walked in and my heart began to melt out of my body. And I began to weep. I began to mourn. I was finally convicted of my sin. And everything in me says, I want what he has. He glows. He carries the presence of God, and I want what he has. It wasn't his preaching. It wasn't his teaching. It wasn't his theology. It wasn't him beating me up with his morality. It was the presence of God that he carried.